Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Doth Protest, a podcast on Reformation history and theology. And of course, we have recently resumed the podcast after a several month hiatus, but we're back now for our usual 2 episodes per month-ish. James is with me today. Good to have you back on, man. It's been a while.
Be here. Yeah.
And today we're joined by our guest, the Reverend Ben Randall, to talk about a new book that came out that he wrote, a new short book and an interesting book, and we'll get into why it's an interesting book. And it's titled Introducing Anglicanism, a Catechism on the 39 Articles. It is a book of catechesis or religious instruction, teaching foundational Christian belief to really people who may be hearing it for the first time. And it's, as I've gathered and sensed, and we'll find out more about this, I think it's geared toward a teenage readership. It's filled with humor and a few pop culture references sprinkled throughout, but we'll get into all that. Ben, or Father Ben, and Ben, do you want to be, how do you want to be referred to on the show?
I'm very happy just to be Ben.
Okay. Ben is an ordained priest in the Church of England, but currently serving in the Episcopal Church, like James and I are. He's currently the senior associate rector at Galilee Episcopal Church in Virginia Beach. Prior to Galilee, he's served in parish ministry in Yorkshire, England, and in rural parts of Tennessee. He holds degrees from Cambridge, the University of St. Andrews, the University of Bradford in conflict resolution. I might ask you more about that later. And is currently, according to his Facebook page, that's where I kind of gleaned some of this stuff. You're working toward a DMin or a Doctorate of Ministry at Southern Evangelical Seminary and Bible College. So welcome to the show, Ben. Glad to have you on.
Thank you. A pleasure.
Now, before we get into the book, I want to introduce, well, I want to spend some time more introducing you and your story on the publisher website for your book that we'll be discussing today. On the publisher website, this is Westbow Press, I believe. There's a little bio of you on there where, and it's the page where your book can be ordered, but it has a little bio of who you are. And I'll put a link in the show notes for listeners to this link. But the short bio, it's like a paragraph. It has some considerable depth to it. It opens up a lot about you and your personal journey, and I'm very interested in asking you more about it. It reads, as an adolescent, you began to doubt, and not only doubt, but resent the Christian faith of your parents. And then it says that you, like too many millennials, unquote, slipped into a lazy atheism. I like that. I just want to ask if you want to elaborate on that before we get into what changed that and when you turned around or whatever. Tell us about that. Your parents, their faith background, you know, what role it may have played in your childhood, you becoming the lazy atheist millennial. I'm interested in kind of you taking us, narrating us through that part of your life.
Yeah, no, sure. I guess if I was to sum it up, I would say I'm an awful cliche. I mean, as a millennial, it almost seems to be the default sort of narrative. Whether I don't know it's in the water or something, but many, I was born in the 80s. Many young people, the 80s and obviously subsequently, I think our default is atheism, or at least it's, maybe it's a loose deism. There is something perhaps, and but really, it's a catch-all. It's a bit of karma. It's a bit of sort of Buddhism, New Ageism, and so on and so forth. But by and large, I think most young people find themselves as they come into adulthood really with no faith, or not a faith that they could really articulate. They could offer you some platitudes, but and certainly they find they don't have a historical Christian faith. Um, and that's the case even if they're brought up in Christian homes. I mean, my parents were deeply committed Christians. My father himself, an Anglican priest in the Church of England. My mum comes from a Swiss Reformed background in Zurich. So both came from, both were very much Christian. My mum did come from a staunchly Christian home. My dad, not so much at all, really. He came to faith later. And so, all my life I was surrounded by church, the Bible, prayer, and so on and so forth. And it was going in one ear and out the other. So that certainly, in my adolescence, like most adolescents, I was sort of rebelling against mum and dad. Basically, I thought the opposite of whatever they thought. And of course, I knew better. And certainly when I went to university at St. Andrews, I knew that I knew better. It seemed very unlikely that there was a God. I would say that I probably was an atheist, or I was on that cusp between agnosticism and atheism. Okay, maybe I'd concede, maybe there's something perhaps, but it's an impersonal God. He's a thing, an it, and he's not interested in us. Why would he be interested in me? Am I so different to the amoebas or something, algae? And so, and I wasn't just, I guess, an atheist. I was actually an evangelistic atheist. If I got the faintest whiff of religiosity about you, and I was a non-discriminatory atheist. I mean, you could be wearing a crucifix or you could be wearing a turban, and I was on your case. With this friendly, not so friendly banter in the pub. Really? You believe all that stuff? No, come on. You pull the other one, looking for loose threads to pull on, as it were, to unravel their worldview. And I was perfectly comfortable with the thought that I knew better than mum and dad. And indeed, now I look back and I see that, by the way, for those listening online, if you can hear jets flying over my head, that's because I'm in Virginia Beach and we're very close to an Air Force base here. And it's Super Hornets flying around. And when we hear that noise, we always say it's the sound of freedom. Anyway, so forgive me for the sound of freedom.
The sound of freedom. Not the sound of silence, it's the sound of freedom.
Yeah. No, it's very noisy as well, the sound of freedom. Forgive me, where was I? That's right. So I was very comfortable saying that I knew better than mum and dad. And now looking back, I would say that I was very much running away from their choices. I mean, mum and dad, being deeply committed Christians, they made a series of countercultural choices. Mum and dad deliberately sought out smaller churches in fairly peripheral contexts. I guess the posh word would be liminal. So, and usually these were contexts where there was a lot of poverty. And so we did, we served a small church in a very poor area in Northern England. County Durham used to be coal mining there. It's all gone. This was a church of sort of 15 old ladies and a whippet. It was a little dog. And it was up to mum and dad to breathe life into these churches. And actually the whole family, my sister played the organ and so forth. And I think I was very burdened by that history. And I needn't have been, but following Jesus seemed to be all sacrifice. I couldn't see the grace at all. So yeah, I was rejecting all that and having a very, very thoroughly good time at university, as again, many young people do. Again, as I say, to summarize my story, it's a cliche. Whether it's premarital sex, drinking, just general hedonism. So I thought I knew better than mum and dad. But what I went to St. Andrews to read philosophy. And it turned out that two of my lecturers were Christian believers. And they didn't, they didn't try to sort of evangelize us, but they did begin gently putting it to us, just a modest case for theism, just that it makes more sense that there should be a God than not. And that, I tell you, Drew, that gave me pause for thought.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I know better than that. Yeah, but my lecturers, forgive me, you were about to interject.
No, I was cutting you off too, though. I'm sorry, but I am going to ask you a little bit more about the turnaround and you really the intellectual discovery, I guess, of that Christianity had a case to make. But you said something interesting earlier, that seeing the example that set forth, at least as you took it in as when you were younger, the example set forth by your parents and the life of faith they led, you could only see the Christian life as that of sacrifice, and but you did but no grace. I'm curious on well, I mean, I kind of know what you mean by that, but like, I guess, well, yeah, what do you mean by that? And when did you feel that grace? I mean, I certainly know you have at this point, but
Yes, indeed. Yeah, praise God. No, indeed. So, I mean, undoubtedly, heavens, read the Sermon on the Mount. I know that you and I both saw the Bonhoeffer movie recently, and the I don't want to ruin it for others, but the final scene is so powerful, and of course, Bonhoeffer begins quoting the Sermon on the Mount. And if that's all that you heard, you would think, wow, you know, this is an extraordinary calling, following Jesus. You know, and and if you saw, myopically, if you were seeing that as it were in a tunnel, and the cross was out of that picture, and so much else besides, of course, but the cross especially was just outside of your vision. Christianity isn't especially appealing. And so yes, as an adolescent, full of hormones and just sort of contrarianism and so on and so forth, when I reflected on mum and dad's choices, these choices to serve these small churches in poor rural areas, poor urban areas, we even were missionaries in the West Indies, but in a very, very poor village, a village constructed of driftwood and corrugated sheet iron and just, children running barefoot and so on and so forth. When I thought about those choices, I thought, I don't want anything to do with that. I want to, I want a rich life, and so forth. And so yeah, I think in many ways my atheism really, and I put this on the back of the book, and I wanted to be candid with people. I want to meet people where they are. My atheism really was a smokescreen for hedonism. Yeah. I wanted to indulge my appetites. So I wanted to have a good time. Everybody else was having a good time. And so, I went to an all-boys boarding school. And suddenly I got to university and there were these funny creatures walking around in tiny little skirts. Terribly distracting. And I spent a lot of time, chasing after them. And but as I was saying, I was reading philosophy, and two of my lecturers began making this case that it made more sense that there should be a God, not a God. And that really gave me pause for thought. And I thought, my gosh, if this is true, this is the most important thing that's true. And everything else is contingent. Everything else is downstream of that. Wow, I need to know. And so I just began reading lots of Christian philosophy. In particular, so name names. Richard Swinburne. I don't know if you know Richard Swinburne. I think Oxford University. He's quite prolific. He has a number of books making the case, the philosophical case, not just for the existence of God, but for the attributes, the traditional Christian attributes of God. That he's a God of love, that he cares about justice, and so on and so forth. And so I began reading this Christian philosophy by Swinburne and others, and it's persuasive. It's persuasive, I would argue, because it's true. You think, Mike, the conclusions, the premises do lead to those conclusions. So certainly by the time I graduated St. Andrews, and it's a 4-year, in Scotland, it's 4-year degrees. By the time I graduated, I was calling myself a Christian, but it was very much a head knowledge. I was a Christian because, frankly, it was logical. It seemed to be, and I would argue to this day, absolutely. I think, what's the expression, that philosophy is the handmaiden of theology. And James, that is my experience. That's my experience, that Christianity is uniquely credible. And I had this voracious appetite to know more, And of course, now I see that that's very much the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit was very much at work in my life. And it was like I was a snowball rolling downhill, gathering this sort of momentum. However, for me, there was a catch, which was that since I was 8 years old, I had only one ambition, and that was to be a tank commander in the British Royal Army, a cavalry officer. So all the old cavalry regiments are now all armored regiments, and that's what I wanted to do. I was going to be, I don't know, a new Lawrence of Arabia. 9/11 had made quite a strong impact on me. I wanted to do my bit. Everybody on my father's side had served in the forces, including my older sister in Afghanistan. And I was ready to get out there. I very much believed in you might remember the dodgy dossier, this sort of this intelligence report that George W. Bush Jr. and Tony Blair were putting out there, that Saddam Hussein had WMDs, you know.
I remember in our conversation, I think it was maybe 3 years ago now at this point, at a dinner table, we got into a little bit about how you used to be a neoconservative, and
Oh yeah, yeah.
we were talking about neoconservatism, and you
There
were
you
like
go.
the
You
you were
there
like
you
the
have a
poster
memory.
child of neoconservatism. Yeah.
You're looking at him, or you know, a former, but for sure, I was all for it. I bought into it all. I thought, my gosh, yeah, we got to get over them, but it stopped Saddam Hussein, and I wanted to be, and as someone who loved history, I love history, military history especially. I was very much taken up with the romance of the sort of the cavalry regiments of the Napoleonic era. You know, these ridiculous sort of charging down the guns. You know, every man shot. And so I was going to be a Queen's Royal Lancer. They don't exist anymore because it doesn't seem to matter whether it's the Conservatives in power in Westminster or it's Labour. Everybody's thought is to reduce the British Army, increase the budget for the NHS, reduce the budget for the military. And so the regiments are forever being amalgamated into and rebranded. So Queen's Royal Lancers don't exist anymore, but they did when I was interested, and they seemed to like me. I certainly liked them, and so off I went to the Royal Military Academy in Sandhurst, which is sort of like the British West Point, and I had a terrible crisis. So here I was, an absolutely milk Christian, you know, really beginning to explore, all that stuff. And suddenly there I was in the sort of pressure cooker kind of environment of becoming a soldier, and I wasn't at all ready for it. Not spiritually, not emotionally, not psychologically. And I had a terrible crisis in every which way. The only other person who had any kind of religious faith in my platoon was a Mormon. And he and I at first kind of gravitated to each other, thinking, aha, here's a fellow traveler. And then we got into it. And then I thought, no, actually, there are some profound differences between what I'm learning about my faith and what he believes about his. But he pursued me. I'd go into the toilet, and he would take the stall next to mine, and he'd be talking to me underneath, the stall wall, trying to persuade me that Smith really wasn't that bad, in spite of his womanizing and his drinking and so on and so forth. If only I could believe in the golden plates and so on and so forth. I'm going to be very blunt. I think it's absurd. And so I realized, no, he and we have such different convictions. I was at a very low point, very, very low point. I was unhappy that I was unhappy because this was my dream. Here I was, after all, I'd gone through all these various selection tests and things. I'd, passed all these interviews and so on forth, I was supposed to be elated, and yet I was deeply unhappy, really just at such unease with myself. And during an exercise in Wales, I became very, very sick. I'd been sick for a while, actually, but I became even more sick. And I was burning up. And even though it was June, because we were up in the mountains, it was actually snowing. And I had stripped down to my underwear. I was in my boxer shorts. I had my boots on. I was sort of dragging all my gear behind me, slowing down my platoon. No, you can imagine I was getting lots of grief. They were using lots of colorful language. And I was basically delirious. And eventually I collapsed. So basically naked in the snow. It felt like a very large weight was on my chest. I couldn't get air in or out of my lungs. And they realized, oh no, Ben isn't simply being weak or whatever. There's something seriously wrong here. They tried to get me medevaced in a helicopter, but the conditions, the altitude, that wasn't going to work. So the guy on the radio, the sort of anonymous voice, said, well, we can get a snatch, which is British Army slang for a Land Rover. We can get a snatch for about 7 clicks from where you are. You're already way off course. So here you are, British Army officers, we can't use maps or compasses, we're completely lost. You're already way off course. but if you were to deviate another 6 kilometers, we can get a Land Rover to you. And I can't tell you what happened, but at some point, I became separated from my platoon. I don't remember it, but basically, I must have walked in the dark, in the snow, in my underwear for about 7 kilometers. I don't remember any of that. What I remember is waking up in the back of the Land Rover. I can remember the red tactical lighting was on. Again, just trying to simulate kind of combat conditions. It's all pretend, it's a charade, but that's what they were trying to do. And then I blacked out, and then I woke up in a hospital, and the doctor told me that I'd almost died, and I had pneumonia, just, prosaic infection, both lungs full of fluid, and I was in hospital 10 days. But he was serious. I'd almost died. I'd lost weight, and I'm pretty thin. I was skeletal, and I cried out to God. I needed God in my life. I wasn't doing an especially good job of being my own captain, and I needed Jesus to do it. As it goes in the country song, Jesus, take the wheel. I needed Jesus to really take the wheel, and I discharged. I went home, and I had to rebuild my life. So I went back to home to mum and dad, back home to that very Christian environment. But now I was reading my Bible. I wasn't before. Before it was mum and dad's Bible. It was mum and dad's church. Now it was my own. I was interested. I wanted to know. So I began attending local churches and so on. And by fits and starts, I was drawn eventually into professional ministry. But it took a while. It took quite a few years. So forgive me. I've given you that's most of my testimony, but you didn't even ask for it.
Well, no, that is what draws the listeners in for one, but it also drew me very much in too, because it is a testimony to the Spirit at work in your life. And so thank you for sharing that. It was,
yeah.
It's, and, I was going to ask you about, well, James, I don't know if you had something to comment or say.
No, I'm just soaking it all in.
Yeah. Okay. Did you see Bonhoeffer by chance yet, James?
I haven't. And I'm ashamed to say, Ben, I haven't read your book yet either. But
well, it won't take long. It's a very short book. And on the note of the book, and this will be a segue. The last part of the bio on that website I referred to, the website where you buy the book at, and I'll put the link in the show notes for listeners to be able to do that. The last part of this bio said today that you, Ben, are passionate about explaining the faith, using pulpit and podium to persuade others to stand firm against the chaos of postmodernism, unquote. Well, I can definitely see this book that we'll be discussing as doing that. It's really a book of explanation, I think. And I think so much of that is needed because I think there's been a general trend in a lot of more recent times in settings like the Episcopal Church where religious instruction, ironically, is frowned upon. Learning and memorizing scripture passages and basic doctrines have been seen, I think, as has been seen as it's been preferred more to like get into a more intuitive way of learning information because we want to get away from being too bogged down with words or whatever, right? But I think in doing so, we ended up kind of in many ways neglecting the basic building blocks and healthy boundaries and like crucially defining characteristics of what it is to be a Christian. So as for your book, and I can't help but see like there's kind of a parallel in the broader culture. I was reading recently stuff. There's an Atlantic article, and I can't remember the author, but I'll put a link in the show notes. In the broader culture and education trends, educators nationwide got away from making kids read a lot and doing things like phonics, and instead got into like holistic and contextual learning and things. That more intuitive way of forming someone, I guess, for lack of a better way of describing it. Now, as far as your book goes, it's definitely not wordy. It's definitely super accessible, and it's brief. But I felt it was nevertheless concerned with teaching the meat and real substance, or at least getting that across to a young reader. or to a very, very introductory reader who's never had exposure to Christianity. And it was refreshing in many ways too, because I felt like your book made no compromises, like it spoke of like tough themes like sin and hell that I have found some of the few resources put out there through the official Episcopal Church channels for catechesis really shy away from. I mean, your work speaks of God's absoluteness in terms of like the truth of his word, etc. My question, I guess I don't know what my question would be. I think, well, I guess, would you agree, I guess, with my sort of assessment I just gave of the church and the wider culture? And are you kind of aiming with your book, aiming to kind of push back against that?
Yes and yes. It there's no doubt that the sort of the zeitgeist, the main cultural winds that are blowing all around us are also blowing very much in the Episcopal Church. You know, the tail is wagging the dog, and that breaks my heart. I'll be honest with you, because we do have a gospel to proclaim, and that gospel isn't my truth, and it may not be your truth. It simply is the truth. And it's a truth that's been attested to by, well, by an empty tomb outside of Jerusalem. One can go visit it today. So very much, you know, as I looked around, I was shocked actually at how poor, certainly the Episcopal Church, how poor we are being at preparing our young people to grow up to be lifelong committed Jesus-loving disciples. You were saying before that, or at least you implied that we're almost just sort of leaving it to chance. I think that's basically what most people are doing. In fact, I'd argue that I see the same happening even in conservative churches, irrespective of the label out front, that by and large, we're just sort of crossing our fingers and hoping for the best. You know, and when I speak to parents who, you know, because I'll notice, you know, I've been in ministry now more than 10 years, you notice certain trends, and I'll notice that many families that with their children, they'll reach a point where, you know, little Sally or little Jimmy stop coming with mum and dad. Usually it's sort of, you know, so at some point in their teenage years.
Yeah.
And you'll ask, oh, I haven't seen Jimmy, I haven't seen Sally in a while. And the response is usually something along the lines of, well, I just, you know, I don't want to shove it down their throat.
Yeah.
Or something to that effect. And it's just, wow, you know, why roll the dice? You know,
They don't stop taking them to the dentist or the doctor in high school because they don't want to shove all that good stuff about health and dental hygiene down their throats. I mean, you know.
No, that's right. But somehow, you know, spirituality, that's somehow a different category, you know. And so, yeah, very much relativism, subjectivism has absolutely, it's not just infiltrated the church, it's taken the church captive, you know, it's taken us hostage by and large, I would argue. And certainly
in some ways it's also like you know, if we're not, or if they do come to church, there has to be a good, you have to really be, and for one, I think yes, ministers, if ministers are being boring and phoning it in, that's not a good thing. I mean, let's admit that. But you're not going to entertain everyone every Sunday and give them the euphoric experience. And that's another, that's a deadly thing that I think some big box churches have set that precedent, unfortunately. And that's the deadly thing. I think like you know, our families are, it's like, you know, they wouldn't go to a doctor or a dentist expecting them to be like, I mean, yeah, they want them to be nice and everything and ethical and all that, but you know, they're not, you know, if you come to church every Sunday, like wanting your socks blown off by, you know, and it's like, well, this doesn't work for me. It's like you said, it's the subjectivism. They treat kind of spirituality has been compartmentalized as kind of this, yeah, I guess semi-optional thing that you don't have to do. But sorry, I didn't mean to go on about that.
No,
But
thank you. You know, you're really elaborating on the points I was making. And so, So let me offer you some little history for the book itself. I think that'll be very helpful to the audience. Is that so? I was in this small church in rural Tennessee, and but we had lots of young families, lots of little children. And this church, because of its context, not being especially near a big, exciting city, hadn't been able to attract full-time clergy in a long time. In fact, I think when I arrived, it might have been something like 10 years since they had a full-time priest. And so one of the consequences of that was that they had young people who had never been prepared for confirmation to receive communion. So children who really were a little bit too old now for when you traditionally might go through that process, or they had children who were just sort of coming of age. So we had this whole crop of children. And I thought, well, gosh, the time is ripe. Let's prepare them for confirmation. Let's do it right. And I assumed that I was simply going to be able to find the resource that I needed out there somewhere, Amazon or whatever. And indeed, I would argue that we are the church in a golden age of resources. When I look for a devotional for this Advent, for example, I was overwhelmed by the choices. Absolutely, there was countless devotionals for Advent.
Yeah, but when I get emails full of like, I'm sure there's probably a lot of like subpar stuff on it, but it's almost like you don't have to go look for it. They come to you,
They will come to you.
Different publishing companies,
Indeed. And it's not just books. It's also film and video. The Chosen, for example. Mm-hmm. The Chosen. I mean, I think nearly everybody in my parish is watching The Chosen, and has an opinion on that. Or The Passion of the Christ. I mean, that takes us back quite a few years, and so on and so forth. But when it came to finding something that would prepare my young people, I was amazed. I was amazed that it didn't exist. I did not set out to be a book author. This is not my gift. My passion is the local church. And I've created the resource that I need for my ministry. Now, do I hope that others will find it useful? Oh, I pray that they do. But when I went to the Episcopal Church website and looked at their catechisms, and for those who don't know, you said it already, I think at the very beginning, but a catechism, yes, is to prepare people for something significant, like being baptized, taking communion for the first time, becoming a member of a church. When I went looking for a catechism from the Episcopal Church, it was very disappointing, Drew. I'm gonna be as polite as I can and say it's just that. It was very
naming names, yeah. The few titles that probably a lot of people have gone to are just not the good parts here and there, but just not, and I'm not, it doesn't have to be a very, impressive, sophisticated type of word, just something that really well, I don't know. But it's just not good stuff, the stuff that's out there, especially through church publishing and groups like that.
No, sadly not. Not only is it sometimes not the most robust in terms of doctrine,
right?
But also, actually, I would argue that I think production values do matter.
Yeah.
So the catechism that was available that you could download for free was just black text on a white page. Question, answer, learn by rote. I mean, this is very old-fashioned, going back to what you were saying before about where education is at the moment in the United States. But learn by rote. We will tell you what to believe. And why will you believe it? Because it's us, the church, the authorities, telling you so. Because it's Father Ben telling you what to believe. True, James, that is not going to fly. Not anymore. Maybe once upon a time we could lean on the authority of the church. You know what I mean? It's gone. We have no authority. Sex scandals or whatever, it's gone. We have to persuade people, give people a reason for the hope that is in you. That's what this is about. And I think production values, color, images, quizzes, and so on and so forth. This
interactive to an extent as well. Yeah, right. But also avoiding the other extreme. I mean, getting away from the Q&A, just trust us because we're the church and saying this, but also you said give him a reason, and some of the other, again, I've come across some books I've tried to use. It doesn't really give people a reason. It's like, well, this is a nice thing you can do and be a part of. It doesn't, yeah. It's like, here's one thing you can do that might be good for your life.
That's right. And of course, yeah,
I mean,
good for your life, exactly. Moral therapeutic deism.
right.
But instead, what I want to do, yeah, I want to demonstrate that Christianity carries water, that we don't believe these things just sort of arbitrarily because they sound nice. Oh, wouldn't it be nice, eternal life beyond the grave? Wouldn't it be nice, to live in a New Jerusalem? Would it be nice if really God can heal today or whatever? No, these things are either true or they're not true. And my experience, let's begin there. My experience is, wow, yeah, my gosh, my life is extraordinary because Jesus is in it. And I could say much else, but if only I had that, that would drive my ministry, you know, because it ought to drive my ministry. I have received such grace in my life. I want other people to have that grace in their life. In the same way that, I'll watch a good movie, and the most natural thing to do is say, "Hey, have you seen, whatever? It was really good. I enjoyed that. You should check it out." We ought to be doing that about Jesus. And we certainly should be doing that with our children so that they don't believe simply because mum and dad have said so, because Father Ben has said so, because a pope somewhere else has said so. No, I believe this because I myself am personally persuaded. And as I put these truths into action in my life, wow, I did discover abundant life. I did discover that tasting, taste God and seeing that He was good.
So, the book that you did end up writing is called Introducing Anglicanism, but the subtitle is A Catechism on the 39 Articles. And of course, the 39 Articles, it should go without saying for our usual listeners, it's a set of doctrinal statements about what Anglican Christians believe. They can be usually found in the back of, like the current Book of Common Prayer using the Episcopal Church. You can find it in the back. And in past versions of the prayer book, they appear. These statements were composed originally by Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury during the Reformation. They had some revisions since, but the 39 articles don't get a whole lot of attention in many parts of the Anglican world, especially gets neglected in many parts, I think, sadly, in the Episcopal Church. But your book uses the 39 articles as the tool for explaining the Christian faith, and I've read, again, looking at some of some of these not so good resources out there, put out for catechesis and formation for anyone, but including young children. There's virtually nothing about the 39 articles in these things. Some of the stuff, and some of the stuff that they doesn't touch on the articles, nor do they refer to them when teaching the faith. But your book does. Obviously, it's right in the subtitle. Why did you choose the tool? Why did you choose the articles as the tool to teach Christianity with, or the lens that we should see Christianity through?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, well, I was ordained in the Church of England, where very much part of my ordination, explicitly so, I vowed to preach and teach them. Now that I've learned is different. That's not the case in the Episcopal Church over here in the US. Clergy are not being required to say that. I mean, yes to the creeds,
Yeah.
but not specifically to 30 articles. So they're dear to me. And when I was at seminary, theological college in Cambridge, in England, I read a lot. I read a lot. I spoke before, I had this voracious hunger. I'm sure it was of the Spirit. So I was reading a great deal. I wasn't just reading the prescribed texts, my various modules. I was reading so much besides that, outside of that. And I was drawn to Anglicanism. I mean, yes, of course, there I was in an Anglican college, but really, actually, many of my peers, wonderful young men and women who've gone out into the world to lead exciting churches and make a real difference for the kingdom. But many of my peers, it didn't matter to them that they were Anglican, and that's okay. But I became very much enamored actually with people like John Wesley. I read his diaries, I read his letters. I love his brother's hymns. extraordinary figures like that, and also Cranmer. And as I read his articles, or rather read not so much the articles themselves, but because they're in funny Tudor English, but read explanations of the articles by people like Oliver O'Donovan, Martin Davy, and others, I
I would
thought,
add Gerald Bray and J.I. Packer, I think. Both
J.I.
of
Packer, Gerald Bray, indeed. As I read these explanations of the articles, I kept thinking to myself, wow, that's it. Cranmer is hitting the nail on the head. He's taking truths of both testaments and holding them in tension in the way it seems to me ought to be the case. And I don't know. I'm persuaded that the articles actually are an underappreciated, excellent summary of the most important truths that we find in God's holy word. And it's a little bit more to the point than some other catechisms, which other statements of faith, which I very much appreciate. Others become very verbose, and also sometimes I'm going to say this. This is good. This might annoy some people, but maybe go down into some theological cul-de-sacs where they become ever so slightly, I would argue, too narrow, where actually there should be some more breadth. I'll give an example of what I mean. How do we reconcile predestination with the freedom of the will? How do we hold those things in tension? I think in some areas, Cranmer deliberately keeps things a little bit more roomier. And I think actually that's the biblical position. So Cranmer is very much influenced, and again, I'm sure most of your audience will know this, he's very much influenced by Luther, by Calvinists, but he doesn't go down either of those roads. He's listening, and he's taking their insights and synthesizing them actually into what I would really argue is a really excellent statement of faith. And so it's really a tragedy that the Episcopal Church should have pushed them to the back of the prayer book, where nobody's going to look. I think that's, and also I'd argue, I think that's probably of consequence as well for what we then hear from the pulpit.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that I don't see them. I know that the definitely the line of thought behind a lot of the Episcopal Church of the past 150 years, and the thinking behind the general conventions and the people who were behind the 79 prayer book. Perhaps the intention was putting the articles in the back under historical documents. Maybe they were intending to relegate them. Maybe they weren't. I don't know. I tend to not to see it as a relegation. I'll argue it to people who do want to ignore or downplay the 39 articles. I say, it's in our historical document, or they'll say something like, well, it's in the historical documents. It's not a relevant. I'm like, okay, so's the Athanasian Creed. Do we not believe in, the Athanasian understanding the Trinity more? So is the Council of Chalcedon. Do we not believe in Jesus's two natures anymore? So that's not a good argument to say because they're in historical documents means that they're just bygone, But I hear what you're saying, and we devote a lot of time on this podcast, of course, obviously emphasizing the reformational heritage of Anglicanism, which the 39 articles is pretty much what is the top thing that heritage is enshrined in. I mean, outside of the many other works of Cranmer and Hooker, who is a moderate Calvinist himself. So, I mean, we're very much we're very much simpatico here with that. But I'm sorry, what were you going to say, Ben?
No, indeed, absolutely. I was going to agree with you, but it's the reality of putting them at the back, even if it wasn't the intention. Though, frankly, maybe it's cynical of me. I wonder if perhaps it was. But putting it at the back of the book does ensure that they won't generally see the light of day. I mean, likewise, so you say the Athanasian Creed step back there, but indeed, and when have we used that on Sunday mornings?
Right.
So we put it back there, and so it is out of sight, and therefore it's out of mind, and therefore it's absolutely not playing into our worldview. And then no wonder, amongst many other reasons, no wonder many of our young people in the Episcopal Church, in the Anglican denominations generally in the West, often leave us for other denominations or non-denominationalism if they retain any faith at all. And the numbers are really very bleak. They just came out the other day. I was looking at them on the Episcopal Church website. Yes, 2023 was up from 2022, but you compare 2023 with 2019, right before the COVID pandemic, we have lost hundreds of thousands of people in 4 years. And many of those people are young people, young families. So for me, being an Anglican for me has been a most wonderful journey. I want there to be other young Anglicans. I want there to be other generations of Anglicans who are excited by Jesus, who see him through the prism that, the prism of the 39 Articles, which I would argue is a helpful prism, an empowering prism through which to see him, to understand him, to grapple with yes, his glory, his wonderful, complex, fascinating, being.
Well, and I think that a lot of the reason a lot of people will poo-poo the articles or whatever is that it's in 16th century English, and so you can't the immediate access of just looking upon them and and seeing how this is a beautiful encapsulation of the message of Jesus and the gospel. It doesn't click right away. And I don't know, I think the answer to that is people, maybe for people, for introductory readers, books like what you wrote, and for people who are serious inquirers, books like what Gerald Bray wrote. But there's, some, not that your book isn't serious, but it's a audience. But so I think but there's real marrow in the articles, and definitions matter. Knowing it, and identity matters, and I think that's found in the articles of what it is to be Anglican.
Yeah, well, James.
Okay, yeah. So sorry, I'll butt in here. So I don't know that it's even necessarily a matter of 16th century English that's like the barrier, because you have Presbyterians who still use the Westminster Confession of Faith and the Westminster Shorter Catechism and all of that, which is 17th century English, not very long after the articles were written. So those are still used in their original, perhaps archaic for our age language. So, and those are deeply edifying for those different branches of Christianity. I think the bigger concern is that, and this is where I'll show my hand, in the middle of the 19th century, with the rise of the Oxford movement, Anglo-Catholicism, and this sort of wrong-headed belief of arriving at a pre-Reformation Anglicanism, there's this de-emphasis in Anglicanism very broadly, even after Wesleyanism, on the 39 Articles, especially because of the Articles. Ben, I might actually believe that they have a little less room than you would, but I think Article 17 is pretty clear that predestination is obviously by divine action, divine agency alone, and that the will is not free. The will is actually totally, completely bound. So Wesley wasn't okay with that, nor was Newman or Pusey or any of the others. And so what entered in after the First Great Awakening and into the 19th century into Anglicanism was this strain of Arminianism that actually led to a sort of confusion of identity, in my reading, that created, I think, some distrust of the articles as being, sort of only part of a historical moment in Anglicanism, and since then we've sort of moved past them. And then there are others who would say, no, that the articles are still essential, but they would say, in my reading, like a Newman, who in Tract 90 tried to make Anglo-Catholicism work with the articles, and I think did so very poorly, that, they either throw them away as a piece of historical, of a historical moment, a sort of historical snapshot, not worth anything today, or they try and mold them to meet with their preconceived notions. And there are very few folks who are willing to take the articles as the sort of ground and foundation of Anglican confessional Anglicanism, which is what I think they were intended to be, and I think they still should be. And I know that that's a conviction of me because there are some articles that I really wrestle with. I'm very much on Luther's side when it comes to the Eucharist.
Oh,
Uh, and so I don't believe in transubstantiation. I believe that's totally ridiculous Romish nonsense. But uh, I do have a hard time with receptionism, because I do believe in the objective presence. I think eventually we actually sort of get to the same place, Luther and Calvin and Cranmer and, well, not Zwingli. Zwingli's sort of out there, but Luther, Calvin, and Cranmer get at the same place, that Christ is there for you in the Eucharist,
Yeah.
but they come at it from different perspectives. So all I'm saying, that's like me muddying the waters a bit, but all I'm saying is I appreciate the fact that you're actually saying that the articles still matter. Because you're right, Drew and I, when we were ordained, we actually had no vow that we would preach and teach the articles. The closest that we got was that we vowed that we believed that the Old and New Testaments were the Word of God
Well,
and
and
contained all things necessary for
can
salvation.
I add to that, James? I don't know if either of you have caught the latest article in the Anglican Way written by Ben Crosby, who's been a guest on this show. Um, the title of the article is "The 39 Articles in the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States." I believe it came out today, or yeah, it's in the latest issue. You can read it online. We actually did indirectly, you, James, and Ben, of course, subscribed to 39 articles because he's from England. But James, you and I indirectly have subscribed to uphold the 39 articles because we're upholding the canons and constitution of the church. Read his argument in there, that the canons and constitutions state that 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 we uphold, that it states that that ministers are to believe in the doctrine of the Episcopal Church, and he gave some precedents to why that doctrine is seen as the 39 articles, which William White would have wholeheartedly agreed with. But anyways, I digress. So no,
White, but not Seabury. Seabury was the reason why we didn't have to actually vow that, because
it's not
Seabury
explicitly
was,
in the vows, but you can make he makes a case that we have
yeah.
the 39 articles. But anyways, it's a great article. I'm gonna put a link for that in the show notes. I just came across it today. I wanted to bring it up in some form or fashion because it's about the 39 articles that we're,
good.
we're
Yeah.
Good. I'm glad you did. And I want to return to a point that you made before, Drew, which I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with, which I think it deserves emphasis. That you made this point about identity, and just obviously I hear I'm going to put words in your mouth, and just correct me, perhaps maybe I misunderstood, but and it actually consciously adopting an identity will do us well, will serve us well, actually,
Mhm.
in this world in which we're assaulted by contrary viewpoints and a great deal of confusion, the chaos of postmodernism, as I put it on the back of my book, um, and that deliberately choosing an identity. Maybe this is going to be one of the most controversial things I say. Deliberately choosing an identity over and above my Christian one, and as it were, a sectarian identity, is like putting a guardrail around the law. It's like an oral law that protects me from transgressing the actual law. I think today many people feel so deeply unmoored from the very things that actually used to shape people, um, uh, that a sectarian identity. And I know that sounds like a somewhat pejorative word. Often we use it pejoratively, don't we? But I think actually can serve us quite well. To sort of say, I am about this thing. This is the thing. This is where my loyalty lies. I am committed to this. so that we don't find ourselves sliding down a sort of theological slippery slope and an ethical slippery slope. So just maybe you heard recently the British Parliament passed a bill which basically makes euthanasia legal. And why wouldn't they do that? Pagans are gonna pagan. And from an Epicurean point of view, where it's about maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain, well, no wonder you would do that. Oh, I'm old, I'm infirm, I'm in some sort of chronic pain from this condition that I have. I'm going to check out now. These things, this is inevitable because we have become so unmoored from the truth, but certainly from a biblical worldview. And I think actually, and so to have overlaid an Anglican, as it were, sort of sectarian identity over the top of that wouldn't be a silver bullet. Of course it wouldn't be, but might have helped.
Yeah.
I also think of I'm sorry, go ahead, Drew.
No, go ahead, James.
Just to piggyback on that, as a matter of identity, I think the articles also function, the way I tend to think of them is also a sort of hermeneutical identity. So it's the way that we read the scriptures. And that is something that may not make as much sense to someone who is not yet on the inside, someone who's learning about the faith but yet doesn't have faith per se just yet. That's something that you sort of enter into when you are catechized, that you learn the faith, and you learn the faith through this particular lens, and it becomes the lens through which you read the scriptures. So that's something I would add to what you're saying, Ben.
Thank you.
I was kind of just, of course, it's a short book. I think it's 96 pages. Again, going to have a show note a link to in the show notes. And I just I like the style you kind of wrote it in, because you obviously you go through each article, you have a text of each article, you then relate. I don't know if an excursus is the right word, but you spend a few time, you write a little bit for each one, relating it to life now, and you will use a lot of illustrations to try to engage the reader. You stick humor in there, you stick pop culture references, and you also kind of weave. People get actually, what I like about it is people get to actually learn about history, church history too. It's not just doctrine; it's also history. You get in the lives. You have a thing in there about Queen Elizabeth. Luther and Zwingli both find their way in there. Cranmer, learning about these past Christians, these past people, and their story, and so I like how you did that. What was kind of when you set out to write this? What was, I mean, as far as these stylistic things and how you were and the layout? How did you end up going with that way of doing it?
So I've said already that I was very much, I remain very sort of animated that the traditional catechetical approach, just question answer, black text, white page, that won't do anymore. I mean, and so I knew from the get-go, I want there to be pictures and so on and so forth. I want to actually persuade. I want to convince you of what is true. But yeah, I'm going to try and charm you as well. Absolutely. And so brevity is so important. Yes, it's a small book. You can read it in an hour and a half. That, again, very deliberate, because there are some wonderful, larger resources. We've named some of them, the authors at least, today. So if you really want to geek out, go for it. Dive in. But let's face it, most people don't really want to, because the new season of Yellowstone is on, or whatever it is, because life is busy. It's full already. So pick your battles. I would much rather begin the conversation, plant some seeds, arouse your curiosity about Edward VI or, Henry or whatever. Arouse your curiosity so that later maybe you'll come to me, or you'll go to your pastor, whoever your local pastor is, and you'll say, Father Bob, I've read this thing, I found it exciting, it was engaging. Can you tell me more? Wow, Drew, that's a victory, if that's the case.
Yeah.
Just to get the ball rolling. And also, again, this idea that we are becoming very much unmoored. And lots of people are saying that. I'm not taking any credit for something. That's not something I've noticed, but lots of people are noticing that. This idea that it's up to me, here I are, every person is sort of a big bang who's got to kind of figure it all out for myself. And no, actually, no, all of us are dwarves standing on the shoulders of giants. People have gone before who are far wiser than I am, whose sermons are wittier, more insightful, whose exegesis is sharper, and so on and so on and so on. So, why not simply tell you what this other clever person has already observed in the text? It doesn't have to be about me. So I'm not trying to build a platform for myself. I want to take you and point you in the direction of the articles. I want to point you in the direction of Cranmer, not towards Ben Randall.
Mm.
Go to them because it's rewarding. You will be rewarded. So again, that's why the book is brief. That's why it's sort of got that chatty kind of conversational tone and so on and so forth. And as you said as well at the beginning, yes, at the forefront of my mind when I wrote it are teenagers, because I see that's where I began to drift.
Mm.
First, it was a very minor adjustment. It was subtle. And then, as the years passed, I realized that just like a ship, a ship turns just one point on the compass. And then, but 100 miles from the point where it began, it's nowhere near its destination.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I in particular, I want to see young people. I want to see them love Jesus the way he deserves to be loved. I want to see them love Anglicanism again as that prism, that way of loving him, and so on and so forth. So yeah, with that in mind, with as well knowing what the average reading age of Americans is, it's surprisingly low. These are all reasons why I sort of took the route that I did with this particular book. Yeah.
Yeah. I had a couple. I know we're coming up on time pretty quick here, and I want to respect that. I did a couple questions about the articles, getting specifically into the articles. Of course, the 39, and I'll just kind of refer listeners again, referring to this book, but also the 39 articles. You can, a lot of our usual listeners will have them in a prayer book and know these articles, but you could also just do a quick web search and pull up the 39 articles of the Church of England, or of the Episcopal Church. It's the same thing. And so, and read them. And, it's all, but there are, as James said, sometimes, even for people who find themselves very much in the spirit of these articles, there's even things in there that we wrestle with, because it addresses everything about the Christian life, pertaining from, and not exhaustively. It leaves room and breadth, but it covers who God is, what we are, how that relates, gets into things like salvation, heaven, hell, purgatory, which says it doesn't exist, by the way. But one, predestination is one of those, and James brought it up earlier. I was curious to pick your head because I like what you said about it. You write, and you kind of put it in terms of, well, I'll just quote you. You said on your part about where you write about the article of predestination, you say, quote, if you then, having heard the gospel, the good news, find that you desire to become one of those people, his people, you're the reason that anything exists. He made this universe millions of years ago with you in particular. And I agree. However, I'm curious, because I'm curious to know kind of your interpretation of that article, because I've never personally, I've never read this article, and I think other interpreters, like I think Gerald Bray's with me on this. I've never read this to be a support of what would develop in Calvinism as a double predestination. Um, that some are destined for heaven, some are not, but rather, I always read this article in the sense of how predestination was used biblically, and I think in like
Right.
Luther or you could call it a single predestination, a reminder for Christians to have hope because eternal glory awaits them and nothing can take that away. Like, period. That's, which I seem to that which you kind of articulate too in what I just quote. But what do you how do you interpret that article of faith about predestination in our article? I'm just curious.
So, my hang up around predestination, certainly years ago, was that somehow it meant that my choices weren't really my choices. That, agency that I feel that I have was pretense, illusory, and I was just sort of a pawn on a chessboard. But what I think Cranmer does, I think that Cranmer's view of predestination does not entail meticulous sovereignty. I absolutely believe that one does not have to follow the other, and that actually it's the case that it doesn't.
Meticulous sovereignty meaning.
So yeah, forgive me, I'm using jargon, meaning that everything that does happen is decreed by God to happen, that he's sort of a micromanager of all that happens. Now, that's very much John Calvin's view. Having read the Institutes, it's very clearly there, as it is elsewhere in his writings. That's not what Cranmer is saying. I think what Cranmer sees is that God can foreknow all that will take place without having to make it take place. And that's terribly important, especially since if ultimately, as I argue in that article, my explanation of that article, if ultimately it's really about to maximize love, because that's what God is. He is love. He wants to see that there is more love. To that end, therefore, he must create creatures that can choose, because robots don't love. They don't. You might press the right buttons and they might go through the motions of being loving, but actually we all would know that they're not really in love with anything, certainly not in love with their creator. So God must create creatures that are capable of turning their back on him. Mm-hmm. So much, of course, of the biblical story is exactly that. And it breaks God's heart again and again. But nor is he surprised, nor can he be surprised.
Yeah.
And really, I was helped, and again, this is clear in the book, I was very much helped, as it were, to be reconciled to this idea of predestination, to the truth, the reality of predestination, by Leibniz. So Leibniz, not an Anglican philosopher, but Leibniz, a German philosopher, he was charged in the 17th century with trying to find a way to reconcile in his little German state, because of course at that point Germany hasn't been born as a modern nation, it's a collection of smaller states. He was charged with trying to reconcile the Calvinists and the Lutherans, who were really at each other. And Leibniz believed the key to reconcile the Lutherans and the Calvinists in particular lay in the Articles of Religion. Not many people know that. He had been sent a copy of the Articles of Religion, and he thought that this was going to be the key that would unlock that would diffuse this tension, this theological dispute between the Calvinists and the Lutherans. And so really it was Leibniz's writings about how he understood predestination in light of what Cranmer had written, that really was, just eye-opening to me. And that's why I put it in the book. And to that end, I then found that, to my interpretation, that people like Jonathan Edwards would agree, I would argue. Yeah.
What were we going to say, James?
I was going to say, so one of the concerns that people often have with predestination is that what place does the will have, right? And I think the way that Luther and I would argue Cranmer, what they would say is that the will, the sort of organ of decision, is itself broken by sin. Doesn't mean that our choices are determined. I mean, I can freely choose to set this desk on fire if I wanted to. And It's not as if that is in and of itself determined, but what the will does is it's always going to turn in on itself. It's always going to turn in on the heart and what the person wants, what I want, the kingdom of me, as it were. So we must have more than just a prevenient grace. We must have a God who draws us to himself irrespective of what we want because we don't want him. That's sort of our natural plight. And we need a God who not only draws us to himself irrespective of our will, we need a God also who sustains us even when the old Adam rears his ugly head every day.
Yeah.
So I think that's what's so terribly convincing about Luther and Reformation, Anglicanism, Reformation Christianity in general. That the natural tendency is to sort of, as you're saying, Ben, think more of Cranmer in the Reformed camp and really the Calvinist camp, where Calvin had to have every question answered just like the scholastics, and that's why he had to have double predestination, because it was the logical outcome of single predestination, as opposed to saying what we have declared in Scripture is that predestination to life is there, but what we need to conclude from that is that predestination to death is as well, which is just not true. That's not there. So I think Cranmer is more on Luther's side in that regard, that he's willing to allow some things to just sit. What you were saying earlier about holding things in tension, perhaps.
Yes. That's right. That's right. And of course, I mean, ultimately, since God is an all-knowing God, and because, again, I explained this in this chapter about predestination, thanks to what Leibniz was able to show me, that because therefore he's going to only create the creation that brings about his purposes amongst various alternatives that surely exist. Therefore, he also knows, therefore, who will be born, and the lives that they'll live, and whether they will put their faith in his gospel or not, in the atoning death of his son Jesus Christ on the cross. And so ultimately, that is going to be a difficult pill to swallow for those who haven't yet experienced the free gift of the Holy Spirit, transforming their attitude towards these matters. That will always be the case. It is the case that God has created a world in which he knows full well and good that who will reject his gospel. It can't be otherwise. It can't be otherwise. But I do agree with you. I agree with you, James, that I see Cranmer leaning more towards Luther's side of the argument in this. I really very much do. I just don't want us to pretend, things that I don't want us to pretend. What we mustn't do is believe things because they're palatable. It's the truth that sets free.
Mm-hmm.
The stuff that's hard to hear.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, Ben, that's a good note to close on. The truth sets free, and sometimes it's hard to hear. But I want to thank you for your time today, and well, this evening really, and because I know it's a little bit later for y'all being in the Eastern time zone. But thank you, and again, I encourage our listeners to check this book out, and especially if you maybe have younger members in your household, and and encourage churches, ministers, those, whether the priest or this person overseeing confirmation, to give this book a look. It might be the good resource to use, or one of a few to use, and I just encourage readers to check it out. So God bless both y'all. Merry Christmas. And because that's upon us. By the time this episode's out, it'll be shortly after that. So
Right.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, James. So it's good.
Thank you.
Good to be back. God bless.
Good to be with you.